Americans pride themselves as being a nation of immigrants, and even the first Americans, the so-called Native Americans, are immigrants to this country, arriving thousands of years ago into the Western Hemisphere. Today we're going to discuss this development. We're going to discuss the arrival of Native Americans into the Western Hemisphere, and we're also going to discuss the development over time of a diversity of cultures in what is today the United States. First of all, let's talk about the arrival of Native Americans. According to historians, this arrival occurred over 12,000 years ago when the world was in the grip of the last great ice age. And at this particular time, the ocean levels in the world were a lot lower than they are today. So what is today the Bering Strait, that area that divides Alaska from what is today Russia, that was actually land. And it was a big area of land. And this land bridge is what allowed people from Eurasia, from the Eurasian landmass, to cross over and settle in the Western Hemisphere. Now, when this migration first occurred, these peoples who settled in this area were hunters and gatherers. They lived off of hunting animals and gathering wild fruits and berries, and they had to travel all the time. That's what we mean by the word nomadic. And now historians have determined that the first culture to inhabit what is today the United States were these hunters and gatherers. And this culture is called Clovis culture. Now, it's called Clovis culture because this culture was first discovered by archaeologists in Clovis, New Mexico. But archaeological discoveries have shown that this culture flourished over a large area of the United States. And now, these Paleo-Indians, as they're called, they were hunters and gatherers, and it's called the Paleolithic culture, or Old Stone Age culture, because these hunters and gatherers used stone tools and weapons in their everyday use. And these stone tools and weapons have been found across much of the United States. So Clovis culture is, in effect, the first culture in what is today the United States. Now, a majority of historians, many historians, believe that this migration occurred roughly 12 to 14,000 years ago, and that this first culture in the Western Hemisphere was Clovis culture. But not all historians are on board. Not all archaeologists are on board with this view. In fact, archaeologists have found evidence of stone tools as far south as Monteverde, which is in Chile. And this is, if you look at a map, you can see that Chile is way far south compared to what is today the United States. And these stone tools have been dated to about 14,000 years ago. So that begs the question, how could hunters and gatherers get so far south so quickly? Now, one hypothesis would be that this migration may have occurred maybe thousands of years previously to 14,000. Another observation could be that perhaps Native Americans were able to travel by boat, and this allowed them to travel very quickly from, let's say, the coast of Alaska down the Pacific coast down to what is today Chile. And in fact, archaeologists have found evidence on the Channel Islands in what is today off the coast of California. They have found evidence that dates to about 10,000 years ago that there were people there. They found stone tools and weapons. So that would seem to indicate that early Native Americans had the technology to travel by boat and cover long distances, and that might explain the evidence for stone tools in Monteverde so far south in Chile. Now, other historians have argued that perhaps this migration occurred perhaps thousands of years earlier than 14,000 years ago. In fact, I just read recently that an archaeologist in Brazil has found evidence of stone tools in Brazil that date to 22,000 years ago. So just to be clear, there's not all historians are on board with the idea that Clovis culture 14,000 years ago is the first evidence or the first people the Western Hemisphere. So now that we've discussed the arrival of Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere, now we need to talk about the development of diverse culture. Now, from a period from about 5,000 years before Christ, that would be about 7,000 years ago, to about the time of Christ, this is a period known as the Archaic period. And archaic means beginning. It's a fancy word for beginnings. And in this period, what we see happening is that different cultures in different parts of the United States had to adapt to their environment. And this can be clear by just looking at the different cultures. Now, for example, the Chumash. Let's look at them. The Chumash lived in coastal California along the Pacific coast, and they lived off the coast. They lived in a fairly warm climate. They lived off of the sea and off of acorns, and they developed a certain particular lifestyle and culture as a result of the environment they lived in. Now, if you can contrast that to a people on the East Coast, the Iroquois. Now, the Iroquois, they lived in the woodlands in what is today upstate New York. And there they have cold winters, and it's a much colder climate than in California. And of course, they had to adapt. They built very sturdy longhouses of wood where they lived. So that would just be one example of how two different Native American groups living in different parts of the country and in different environments created different cultures as a result of the circumstances that they found themselves in. Now, during the Archaic period, one of the most profound developments during the Archaic period is the arrival of agriculture, and especially of Indian corn or maize. Now, maize originated, the domestication of Indian corn or maize, think of corn on the cob, this actually occurred in Mexico. And it was probably about 9,000, 7,000 years ago. But by the time of Christ, that would be about 2,000 years ago, the cultivation, the ability to domesticate corn and to raise corn was introduced originally to what is today the Southwest, like Arizona and New Mexico. And over the course of the centuries, it moved north. And so by the time you get to about 1,000 years ago, raising corn and agriculture had reached, let's say, New England and northeastern Canada. So that was probably one of the biggest developments in culture, making the transition from hunting and gathering to a culture where you're raising crops and depending upon crops for your sustenance. Now, you could spend a lifetime studying all the diversity of cultures. We mentioned the Chumash of California, we mentioned the Iroquois of New York, but the fact of the matter is that it would be impossible in this short lesson to cover all this information. So what I'd like to do is to try to kind of give you a general idea of Native American cultures. Now, and one way to do that is the common classifications that archaeologists and historians use when they look at cultures. Now, of course, a culture is a way that a certain group of people live and adapt to their environment. And historians divide or categorize cultures into simple and complex. And so now it's important to remember that when you talk about simple and complex cultures, that you can't just say there's not a fine line or there's not a sharp division between them. So you kind of think of a spectrum where, like, on one hand, the most simple culture would be a hunter and gatherer, like the first Indians who arrived. They would be the Paleo-Indians who arrived who were in the Clovis culture. They would be the example of the more simple culture. And then on the other side of the spectrum, on the far side of the spectrum, you'd have, let's say, 21st century New York City. Now that would be on the far other side. That would be a complex culture. Now in between those two extreme simple and extreme complex, you find a whole spectrum of different cultures. Now when you look at all of the Native American cultures in the United States that developed in their totality, what you find is most of them fall along this being a simple culture. So they're more simple culture as to being, rather than being more complex culture. So if we understand the attributes of a simple culture, we can understand some of the common cultural attributes of Native Americans. So let's look at these. Well, first of all, one important aspect of a simple culture is a very scattered population. So what you find is that in a simple culture, you have hunter-gatherers who are on the move and traveling from place to place, or people living in very tiny, small communities and basically it's very a rural existence. You don't have big cities or towns. A second characteristic of a simple culture is that you have what we call a subsistence economy. In a subsistence economy, the basic unit is a family. And the family is responsible for producing all of its basic needs. Its home, its housing, its shelter, its clothing, its food. So basically, every family is responsible for its own needs. And that's what you find typically in a simple culture. Thirdly, what we find in a simple culture is that we find that it's non-specialized. You see, since everybody has to provide for their own food, their own housing, their own clothes, people don't have time to specialize in a particular field. For example, they don't have time to devote all their time to learning a particular trade or a particular craft because they have to spend time just to meet their daily needs. So what we find in these cultures is this non-specialization. Another attribute of these simple cultures is that you don't have a government. Instead, families police themselves. Among a lot of Native American tribes, you'd find that when there were disputes, the elders of the family would be the ones who would work to resolve differences. So people were organized along a tribal basis. For example, families would be organized into larger extended families or clans, and clans would be in turn organized into larger groups of tribes, and perhaps the tribe would all claim to be descended from a common ancestor. So in a simple culture, what you find it's the elders, the older people within the family, within the clans, within the tribes. They're the ones who are responsible for keeping law, keeping order, keeping the peace. But you don't have a formal system of government. Finally, a last feature of a simple culture is that they're very egalitarian. By that I mean that there's not even if there are differences in social classes, they're not that great. In other words, the people who are the richest and the wealthiest don't have a lifestyle that's particularly different from that practiced by the lowest people on the totem pole. Often in a simple culture, leadership is not based on one's social position as much as it's based on one's personal qualities. For example, if you're tall, or in a lot of cultures, a man who is tall and brave and a great warrior, regardless of his background, might come to a position of leadership just by his personal characteristics. Now, it's important to remember that when you talk about Native American societies as being simple, it's important to remember that that doesn't mean that they were primitive or that they uncivilized. Those words really don't apply. What we find when we look at Native American cultures is that there are degrees of simplicity and degrees of complexity. This give an example, the Cherokee. Now, the Cherokee were inhabited what is today East Tennessee and South Carolina, North Carolina, and North Georgia, and they lived in pretty substantial towns, which were even fortified by wooden stockades. So that would indicate a degree of complexity. They also were pretty well organized. The Cherokee were organized into a confederation of towns. So that indicates a degree of political organization that we associate with a complex culture. Also, if you look at their basketry and their pottery, their work shows a degree of specialization, that they were people obviously who were good at producing specialized crafts. But what's important to remember about the Cherokee also is that we don't see the same degree of complexity that we would see in, let's say, some of the more complex cultures that would develop, like the Maya and the Aztecs in Central and South America. So just keep that in mind when we talk about Native American cultures as being predominantly simple. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily primitive. Now there were some complex cultures that developed in what is today the United States, and that will be what we'll study in our next lesson.